Meeting California's 2030 electric vehicle mandate could cost Uber and Lyft a staggering $173 billion. For years, the ride-hailing industry operated on a simple, aggressive premise: grow at any cost. Uber and Lyft didn't just compete for riders, they competed to see who could subsidize the market more effectively. In the world of venture capital, this is a war of attrition. The goal isn't necessarily to be profitable on day one, but to achieve such massive scale and brand recognition that you become an inescapable utility. But by 2019, the cracks in this strategy were becoming impossible to ignore. While Uber and Lyft were generating billions in revenue, they were struggling with a fundamental mathematical problem. They were losing money. For some, this was a calculated investment in infrastructure, similar to how Amazon operated for a decade. But critics argued there was a key difference. Amazon was building warehouses and global logistics. Uber and Lyft were spending their negative margins on sales and marketing, essentially paying people to use a service that cost more to provide than it earned. To understand the mechanism of the subsidy war, you have to look at the margins. In 2019, data suggested Lyft had margins around 30%, while Uber sat at 20%, with Uber Eats trailing at 10%. On the surface, Lyft looked more efficient per ride. But Uber had the scale. Uber was a global giant, while Lyft was largely a North American player. The strategy was to use investor cash to keep prices artificially low, lure riders away from private car ownership, and bankrupt any smaller competitors. It was a race to the bottom where the winner is simply the last one with money in the bank. As the companies moved toward IPOs, the market began to ask, when does the subsidizing stop? When the music stops, the people who have been paying less than the actual cost of the ride, the riders, and the drivers who rely on these platforms for their livelihood, will eventually have to pay the difference. This tension came to a head not just in the boardroom, but in the streets. In May 2019, drivers marched through San Francisco's financial district, demanding fair wages and transparency. The core of the conflict was the employment status. Uber and Lyft fought to keep drivers as independent contractors, a victory they secured in California, avoiding the massive costs of providing employee benefits. But a new, more expensive battle was emerging: the transition to electric vehicles. By 2021, California regulators, through the Air Resources Board, set an aggressive mandate. They wanted 90% of ride-hailing vehicle miles traveled to be electric by 2030. Both Uber and Lyft had already publicly committed to 100% EV fleets by that same year. It sounded like a corporate win for the environment, but the math was brutal. Converting a fleet isn't as simple as buying new cars. Unlike a traditional taxi company, Uber and Lyft don't own the cars, the drivers do. And the drivers, many of whom are lower-income minorities with poor credit, cannot afford the high upfront cost of an EV. The Union of Concerned Scientists estimated that meeting California's 2030 standard could cost a staggering $173 billion. This created a strange paradox. The companies that had spent years fighting the government to avoid paying drivers benefits were now asking the government to pay for the cars. Uber argued that no single company could bear the cost alone. Lyft went further, claiming that existing government subsidies only helped high-income homeowners, while their drivers needed more public support to make the transition feasible. Senator Nancy Skinner, who introduced the legislation, wasn't buying it. She argued that the companies should pay because their business models increased carbon emissions by adding more miles and more trips to the road. The dispute highlighted a deeper truth about the ride-hailing model: the companies provide the platform, but they push the operational risks and costs onto the drivers. Even the efficiency of EVs was debated. Regulators pointed out that ride-hailing vehicles are actually more polluting per passenger mile than private cars because drivers spend over a third of their time cruising, driving around empty while waiting for a request. To fix this, the state suggested that, instead of converting every single car, the companies could just focus on the full-time drivers who rack up the most miles. Beyond the environmental fight, the companies continued to clash with city governments over control. In New York City, a law was passed requiring companies to give drivers 14 days notice before deactivating them from the app. Uber and Lyft fought this in court, arguing it was unconstitutional and threatened safety by keeping potentially dangerous drivers on the road. A federal judge eventually blocked the law, ruling that the company's right to police their platforms outweighed the city's requirement for notice. So, who actually won the subsidy war? In terms of raw power, Uber emerged as the dominant force. With a valuation of roughly $86 billion compared to Lyft's $16 billion, Uber's global reach gave it a scale Lyft couldn't match. But the win is qualified. Both companies spent a decade proving that they could capture a market, but they struggled to prove they could sustain it without burning through billions of dollars of investor capital. The war didn't end with a victory lap. It ended with a transition into a fragile oligopoly, where the fight shifted from winning riders to fighting the government over who pays for the future of the road.